Welcome to my ultimate guide to Archazia's Island. Give the video a like if you're excited. I have so many decks to share with you, the very top meta predictions. I'm also going to be talking at length on how to beat the inevitable onslaught of Sapphire. Because Belle, this wonderful new common card, is very strong. She's able to sing Let the Storm Rage On and Strength of a Raging Fire in a very similar way to Cinderella Ballroom Sensation, who is still going to be everywhere, by the way. And therefore, I think that cards like Maleficent and Curse Merfolk, which are usually cards I'm such a big fan of, might be wise to avoid using those with Cinderella and Belle likely to be everywhere. Let's start off by looking at the top decks of the metagame, and then we can start discussing how on earth we might try and beat these decks. And thank you to Card Market, who sponsor my channel. If you guys want to get better at Disney Lorcana, don't forget to check out my Metafy page in the description below. There's awesome perks for supporters, such as one-to-one deck building advice from myself, as well as coaching sessions available. If you join and support on Metafy, you also get access to the private Discord channel where I post all of my deck lists there before I post them anywhere else. The first deck which really encapsulates this new meta is Sapphire Steel, and that's because it maximizes Belle, Apprentice, Inventor. Belle is a 3-cost character which you can play on turn 1 by banishing an item. Of course, Sapphire has a bunch of items, but the best item to banish for Belle is going to be an item which draws you a card, which is why Steel makes a lot of sense. You not only have the Porpsicle, but also the Fortisphere. Added to that, Belle being a 3-cost character is particularly significant if you want to sing songs which cost 3 or less, and Steel has the best 2 in the form of Let the Storm Rage On and Strength of a Raging Fire. But for example, if you're playing a Amber Steel mirror matchup, let's say, your opponent on turn 1 plays down a Cinderella Ballroom Sensation, and you try to respond with a Cinderella Ballroom Sensation of your own, you're going to be in hot water because your opponent is able to sing Let the Storm Rage On and remove your Cinderella immediately before yours got to do anything. But let's imagine instead your opponent plays Cinderella on turn 1, and instead of you replying with a Cinderella, you're playing Sapphire Steel, you play down a Fortisphere, you draw a card, you banish the Fortisphere for free, you play Belle, and suddenly your opponent has a Cinderella and a Let the Storm Rage On in hand, but they're not able to remove your Belle. Of course, potentially they could, if on turn 2 they play 2 more 1-cost characters and sing Strength of a Raging Fire, but you're asking a lot more of them in order to remove that. And if they don't do that, if they don't remove your Belle, well, suddenly your Belle can sing Storm Rage On next turn and remove your opponent's Cinderella. And I think that is just an example to show you how strong Sapphire Steel will be this set. Now, of course, you could go down the dock route with Sapphire Steel, but there's many other ways you can build Sapphire Steel. Of course, Fishbone Quill and A Whole New World combine very well together, so that's an option. But for me, this is the front runner, just this style of deck. And there's a few new cards in here. Mulan is, in my opinion, the best inkable 1-drop outside of Amethyst and maybe outside of Cinderella Ballroom Sensation. I think Cinderella Ballroom Sensation slightly has the edge over Mulan, but you kind of have one of those already, in a sense, with Belle. The reason Mulan is so good, because a lot of people are going to say, well, especially this is just Simba with the opposite stats. And yes, it is just Simba from set 1 with the opposite stats. But having 2 strength and 1 willpower is so much better for a 1-cost character than 1 strength and 2 willpower. What is one of the biggest weaknesses of dock decks? It's drawing 2 docks in your hand at once. And these Sapphire Steel decks just don't have an abundance of strong 1-cost characters. There's the Food Fighter Mickey, which you could consider. There's Happy if you want to play the Seven Dwarfs Mine. Both considerations. But Mulan just frankly blows both of those cards out of the water. This is one of the best cards of the set. You've got Calhoun, which is of course great. Smee, you can't go wrong. And then the Alice Savvy Sailor is just incredible. And we don't see Alice as much because most Sapphire decks want to ramp, but you're able to play Alice down and give ward to a Gantu, and it just can't be removed. Imagine you quest with Alice, you give your Gantu ward, and it quests for 5. That is just so difficult to contend with. But there's also another new card in the mixer, which is probably the card I'm most excited for, actually, for Archazia's Island. And this is JAFAR Aspiring Ruler. And of course, it's going to be fantastic in an all-out purple steel JAFAR deck, but JAFAR Aspiring Ruler is very similar to Merlin Crab, except it quests for 2 and it has slightly different stats and a slightly different ability. It also quests for 2 after that fact, which I think is really significant. This deck is looking to win the game relatively quickly, and that 1 extra lore makes a huge difference. Of course, it does also have 1 willpower less, but I think JAFAR is a great option, particularly when you don't have access to the crab. Like, this color combination doesn't even have access to the crab. Being able to make your Calhoun a 5 strength character, or your Mulan a 4 strength character, or your Doc a 3 strength character, all of these things are surely going to be quite important. Now, there's definitely some flexibility in what you do with the rest of the cards. Baymax, I think, is a really nice card. I could definitely see the deck ending up playing more copies of it. 3 copies of Hiram, you might want to just stick with 4. Obviously, you're going to be banishing some items with Belle. There's also the Tamatoa card, which is absolutely worth considering, the new legendary Tamatoa. This is going to be able to put items from your discard back into your hand. I think that card's really worth taking a look at, as well as the 7 Dwarfs Mine. So there's a lot of different things you can do with this deck, and I don't want you to take this as just a definitive list. Do your own thing, have fun with it, experiment, but I think a deck like this is going to be really, really tough to beat. Staying on the topic of the kinds of decks you need to be able to beat this meta, one of the top contenders was one of the most popular decks at the end of set 6, and quite similar to the Sapphire Steel list we looked at. This is known as Diggy Hole in the community, which I don't call it. I'm going to call it the Mine deck. Brendan DeCandio popularized this list last set, and Ravensburger hired him to join the game development team. This deck was so good, he got hired, I guess. No, big congratulations to Brennan. Really excited to see what he does at Ravensburger. Now, there's not an abundance of new cards, I think, that really fit into this deck, but it was already very strong. I think Mulan is a top contender for similar reasons. Just being able to discard your Doc, I think, makes it quite appealing. And also, I put Snow White in there as a card to seriously consider. This is a very unique card. It can't be challenged. And I think alongside the Lilos, that could give this kind of deck a really nice threat in the late game against something like a Maui Shark. You can quest of the Snow White, and Maui Shark cannot remove it from the board. Okay, I'm sure you guys are going to say, oh, well, Specie, they can just brawl it or they can just cease it. It's like, yeah, okay, but if they don't have that removal card, the Snow White could be an interesting card. You might not want to play it. You might just want to stick to what you played in set 6, but these are the main 2 things. And it does play out in a very similar way to the Sapphire Steel deck. And again, with how popular I expect Cinderella and Belle to be with Let the Storm Rage On and Strength of a Raging Fire, I think it's really important to think about what kind of 1-cost characters you don't want to play. And I think for me, the Merfolk, the Maleficents in particular, sound really risky cards to be playing in this metagame. Which then begs the question, okay, well, you've got on one side decks which are very good against aggro, or aggro cards like Merfolk, and on then the other side, you've got Ruby Sapphire staring down the barrel. So how on earth can you beat both of those things? And that's really going to be the key to cracking this metagame. It's about trying to create a deck which can contend with Cinderella and Belle, but also be quick enough to beat Ruby Sapphire. And I have lots of ideas, don't you worry. In my opinion, the best Ruby and Sapphire deck for this set is going to continue to be Ding Camfam's version of Ruby Sapphire. We are going to take another look at a different version focusing on the new Sapphire Coil, because I already see you in the comments typing out, Specie, what about the Sapphire Coil? Relax. I don't think the Sapphire Coil is all it's made out to be, and we will talk about that why in just a moment. But first, let's talk about why I think this deck list is so good. What is the biggest weakness of Ruby Sapphire? It's aggro decks, right? And I think the Super Goof and the Maui, as well as the Pirate's Life, these cards really, really help you against aggro decks. The most common form of aggro deck is Amethyst, and what they look to do, I play a lot of Amethyst, I can tell you, is play the Magic Brooms, play the Chernobog's followers down early, and then just quest with them as much as possible until they might get removed. Or suddenly this Super Goof poses such a big threat because I can no longer leave those Chernobog's followers and those Magic Brooms on the board as long as I'd like. I have to draw with them when my opponent's at 4 ink, which happens on turn 3. So I think the Super Goof is really, really strong into those more aggro decks. And obviously the Maui as well, helping to clean up the early game. Then you've got the Half Shark, which once the Half Shark's stuck down, it's so difficult to quest with anything. Something like a Pirate's Life gains the Ruby Sapphire player 3 lore, and it makes the aggro players lose 2 lore. So this deck is strong against aggro, and it's also got very good matchups into the decks like the Sapphire Steel deck that we looked at and the Amber Steel deck that we looked at, because those are really aggro decks. They've got some control elements, but they're definitely quite quick. And what Din Can Fam's list is set up to do, it's set up to win quite quickly itself. It's so consistent, it only plays 8 uninkables. That's right, 8 uninkables in Ruby Sapphire, can you believe? That is 4 copies of B-Prep and 4 copies of How Far I'll Go. And you can win the game very quickly yourself with the McDuck manners. You've got the Develop Your Brains and the Vision, which are just pure consistency. Grammar Tala and How Far I'll Go with very similar abilities. The Popsicle draws, the Sail draws, the Flavisham draws. There's just very little in this deck which isn't incredibly efficient. And this deck can win very, very quickly. It can beat those decks that we talked about, those more aggro decks, those sort of mid-range aggro decks as well, if you like. But very importantly, if you're playing in a mirror matchup, Ruby Sapphire, would you rather play this version with the McDuck manners and all these tools, or would you rather play a more greedy version of Ruby Sapphire, a more traditional version of Ruby Sapphire with things like the new Sapphire Coil, things like the legendary Sisu, and these kinds of things? And I think the answer is quite clear. You would rather play this. Therefore, Ruby Sapphire, if you want to win mirrors, you're probably going to play something closer to this. And for me, I think this is going to be better than the versions with Sapphire Coil. But we will also take a look at those because Sapphire Coil, very fascinating card. So my hot take is that Sapphire Coil is the most overrated card ahead of a set release in the history of Disney Lorcana. Clip it and ship it. I don't play Ruby Sapphire. This list is probably a bit wonky. It's the only one in the whole video I don't have much confidence in. But I wanted to just give you guys a general idea of what a Sapphire Coil deck might look like. You're going to play, obviously, the big Sisu. You're going to play the little Sisu. You're going to play some Brawls. And then the rest of the Ruby Sapphire stuff that you really expect to see. I'm not really sure Belle is going to make it into these. But obviously, if you're playing Sapphire Coil, she makes some amount of sense. I'm not really convinced Belle's actually that good in Ruby Sapphire. I think she's a much better card in Sapphire Steel because of her ability to sing. Now, the big question I have about Sapphire Coil is, when on earth are you going to play it? Well, on turn 1, if you were to play Ice Block, for example, you would easily be able to put an Ice Block down. On turn 2, you're going to go Sail, and you could play another Ice Block if you so desired, right? Alongside your Sail. But that Sapphire Coil is going to continue to be stuck in your hand. On turn 3, you've got 4 ink. You could play a Sail or a Tipo alongside your Sapphire Coil, but you'd probably rather just play a Grammar Tala, or you'd probably rather play a Flavisham, particularly if you're going second. It's going to be too passive to just put the Sapphire Coil down. And then imagine on your turn 3, you go Sail and Sapphire Coil, and then your opponent comes through with a Benja. You're going to be in a real world of trouble. And Benja probably going to make a bit of a comeback because a lot of people are going to be playing Sapphire Coil. Benja's in a lot of the lists that I've built that you're going to see later in the video. So, all right, you could play it on turn 3, but probably not. How about turn 4? You're going to be at 5, maybe 6 ink. Well, if you're at 6 ink, you might be able to squeeze it down with like a Tala and a Sapphire Coil or something like that, but you might just want to play the Half Shark if you're at 6 ink. If you're at 5 ink, Brawl and Sapphire Coil maybe, but again, it just isn't that spectacular, and that's the very best case. So the Sapphire Coil is an incredibly strong card, but what people, when they're evaluating the card, are failing to really consider is how slow it makes the deck. Like, what is the biggest weakness of Ruby Sapphire? It's that it takes a while to get going, and the Sapphire Coil kind of compounds that. Now, Don't get me wrong, you are going to be playing against people at your locals and they are going to completely and utterly annihilate you and embarrass you and make you go home with tears on your cheek because of how strong this Sapphire Coil is when everything is set up and in the late game. But the key thing is that you shouldn't be playing a deck which lets them get there consistently. It's going to happen sometimes. Ruby Sapphire, a very strong deck, but you have to make sure that you are playing a deck which does not allow this level of greed to beat you consistently. It is just too greedy in my opinion, and in my view, the better version of Ruby Sapphire is going to be more similar to that Dinkang Familist, which is a little bit more speedy. But if you get to the late game against this Sapphire Coil, it's going to seem very, very unfair. And it is very strong. When I say that it's very overrated, I want to be clear. I've seen tweets from professional players saying that it needs to be banned before the set's even out. That's what I'm talking about when I say overrated. I think the card's great. I'm actually more interested in its potential in a Emerald Sapphire deck. You'll see that in a bit. So we've looked at what I would call the 3 dark horsemen of the Archasia's Island early metagame. I know my local store is going to be absolutely swarmed by Ruby Sapphire, Amber Steel, and Sapphire Steel. So it's important then, as a deck builder and as a player, to think, okay, what decks can I play which are going to be well positioned to do well into that? You need something quick enough to beat Ruby Sapphire, unless you want to try and be more greedy than Ruby Sapphire, which is very difficult to do, but something that can also withstand the early aggression of a Belle or a Cinderella singing Let the Storm Rage On. And if in doubt, you need a deck to just slot perfectly into a metagame, you've always got Amethyst Steel. Now, I have got 3 different versions of Amethyst Steel, and the one I'm showing you is actually the one I've got the least optimism about. But this is what I would call the vanilla version of Amethyst Steel. You've got a few different ways you can go about playing Amethyst Steel. Of course, you've got the Rabbit singing Zeus, which is great into the Maui Half Shark, and I've always been a huge fan of the dock versions of this deck. But I think the dock versions of this deck, I'm down on a little bit this set, in particular because of Belle. The dock versions of the deck, I played Maleficent, and I played Fire the Cannons and Befuddle. If your opponent opens with that Belle on turn 1, you cannot befuddle it, you cannot remove it with Fire the Cannons, and if you play a Maleficent, it's going to get removed. So I think that those dock versions of the deck, for me, are not really the right idea. I think if you're playing dock right now, you probably want the Belle or the Cinderella, so you can do some song singing yourself early on. So instead, I've gone for a more rabbit-heavy list. This is very heavily inspired by Zach Bivens, who finished in the top 8 of the North American Championships. There's a few new cards in here, and the Giant Cobra, a lot of you are going to be surprised there's only 2 of them. You might want to play 4. I just think that this card is really overrated. Now, let me explain why. Giant Cobra is a great card, and we're going to see it in another list I've got for you in a moment, where I've really tried to build around this card a little bit more. I think what's important to recognize with the Giant Cobra is, while I do think this card is potentially very strong, you really have to consider what card are you removing from the deck in order to fit it in, right? Like, it's not like you're just putting the Giant Cobra in the deck and you've suddenly got an amazing new card and it didn't come at any cost, because the reality is Amethyst Steel already had a ton of great cards to put in a 60 card list. So the Giant Cobra comes in and it's good, but the card that you replaced was already good. And that's what I mean when I don't think it's outstanding. I think it's a solid card, and I think it will see competitive play. I think it can be incredibly strong. But what are you actually removing to fit the Giant Cobra? And it's probably the White Rose. And how much better is a Giant Cobra compared to a White Rose? Well, if you need exactly 2 lore and you have an extra card in hand, it's much better. But maybe the White Rose on average is going to be more consistent. It's always going to gain you a lore, even if you don't have that extra card in hand to discard. So Giant Cobra is a weird one. I think that in the list you're going to see next of mine, where I've really built around the card, it can be unbelievably good. But in this kind of list, I'm not so sure. It'll be interesting to see. Another card which I'm really fascinated about the potential of in Amethyst Steel is my friend JAFAR, the Aspiring Ruler. When you play this character, chosen character gains Challenger 2 this turn. It's very similar to a crab. It's Steel's answer to a crab, but it quests for 2. Now, again, you've got a decision to make. Do you want to play crabs or do you want to play JAFARs? Maybe a bit of both. Maybe, I don't know, maybe neither. I like the JAFAR personally because it quests for 2, but obviously the crab is great to bounce and that sort of thing. So JAFAR, I wanted to include it because I think it's interesting that you've got that option. And then finally, actually there's 2 more cards. You've got the Queen, the Jealous Beauty, which is very similar to a Gantu that comes in a bit sooner. You choose 3 cards from your opponent's discard and put them on the bottom of their deck to gain 3 lore. If a Princess card was moved this way, gain 4 lore instead. So if your opponent has a single Princess card in their discard, you can gain 4 lore. The big problem with the Queen is how many times are you going to be able to activate that, and how often are there going to be cards in your opponent's discard. I'm actually not so sure that the Queen will end up making it in this list, but I did want to highlight her. Also, she's able to sing And Then Along Came Zeus, which is quite nice. Of course, you've got a lot of competition in this slot. You might want to be playing the Genies, for example. And finally, the last new card in this one is This Is My Family, a incredibly strong card. Honestly, love it. Gain 1 lore and draw a card. It's a song, so you can sing it as well. And there's obviously potentially song synergies. Now, for me, this deck looks a little bit mediocre, but that's kind of how these Amethyst Steel decks always look. And it's really about building the right 60 cards to fit into the metagame and have a lot of experimentation when you're playing. Consider different cards. There's so many strong Amethyst and Steel cards. The main cards that I would really look at testing and deciding if they're worth it and if you want to play more of is the Cobra. Work out the Crabs and the JAFARs. The Queen, This Is My Family. Do you want to play Genies, for example? I would probably steer clear of the dock setups, which I'm surprised I'm saying because I've always really loved the dock setups. But I do think that the Rabbits with the Zeus is probably the best way to go. I think Gantu, by the way, is a great card. Have some experimentation. And speaking of experimentation, the next Amethyst Steel list I've got for you is very experimental indeed. I've got it sleeved up, ready to go for the day of release. A deck I've always been really fascinated about the concept of is what's known as a burn deck. I've called my deck Burn Baby Burn. A burn deck, it comes from another card game, I actually don't even know where, but it's this idea of gaining lore without necessarily having to quest. You play cards like Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom. And in the previous metagames, it's always been Amethyst, which has a lot of great cards in the burn format with Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, the White Rose, Goat, alongside Ruby, because Ruby offers you the super goof, cards like Thievery, A Pirate's Life, maybe even B-Prep. But I think that's changed with one simple card, and this is the power of dual color cards, because the Giant Cobra is another incredible burn card. In fact, it's possibly the best one as long as you have enough cards in hand. How do you have enough cards in hand? Thanks to the Amethyst Chromacon, a card I've always been a big believer in, and I'm really interested to see how a deck like this might perform. Now, I actually wanted to put 4 Calhouns in the deck. I considered cutting Pete. You could cut some sort of burn card. You might want to play 4 Calhouns. I'm not really quite sure on how to trim the deck down to 60. It was the thing I struggled with most. I considered cutting Pete's. I ended up cutting 1 Chromacon and 3 Calhouns, but we'll have to see where the exact list ends up. But the general idea of this is you play like a normal Amethyst and Steel deck, where you play a card on turn 1, you play a Smee or Calhoun on 2, Fox on 3, but then in the later game, rather than continuing to try and quest when your opponent has the board with something like a Maui Half Shark, you can just play cards like Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom and the Giant Cobra to gain a ton of lore. Let's say you have 5 ink, and you have a bunch of cards in hand because of the Amethyst Chromacon. I can play a Giant Cobra, discard something that I don't want anymore, and play Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom. For 5 ink, I can just gain 4 lore out of nowhere without even having to quest. I think it's a really, really fascinating deck because suddenly there is so many ways you can gain lore without having to quest. You've also got Diablo, which if it's removed, you just draw a card, which is incredible. You've got the Magic Broom, which can cycle itself in the late game as well. So if you want to get rid of that broom and try and draw into some more burn, you could play the Magic Broom for 1, play the Cobra for 3, and just instantly banish the broom to try and draw into a White Rose. Obviously, the Snake and the Fox can bounce back your Goat. You've got the new This Is My Family, which gains a lore and draws a card. And the Bosses on a Roll, I think, is very strong in a burn deck because it allows you to bottom deck cards that you don't want in the late game. So, for example, if on the top 5 cards of your deck, you see a bunch of Chernobog's followers, a Smee, a Calhoun. You can put those to the bottom while keeping cards on the top like Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom. And of course, the boss is on a roll, also gains you 1 lore for your troubles. The other new burn card, if that's what we're calling it, is Honey Marin, who, when you play this character, if an opponent has an exerted character and play game 1 lore. And the thing is this condition is very, very easy to meet. So Honey Marin really is a better version of the White Rose in many ways when your opponent has an exerted card. I think the Calhoun is possibly a card you want to play 4 copies of, because she's going to be strong going second, and you don't have that many uninkables. And of course, you can always discard it with the Cobra, but it was hard to fit everything in. Pete's going to be great up against B-Prep. It's going to be great up against a Pirate's Life, and it might allow you to close the game out. You could, of course, consider also playing the 1-cost Maleficent to have a bit more of an aggro game plan if necessary. I just have my gut feeling is that you might just have enough without that. So this deck basically does away with cards which are trying to contest the board too much. You don't have things like Crab, you don't have things like Zeus, and instead you're just focusing on zooming and just gaining a ton of lore. And I think it's a really, really interesting concept. And it's the giant Cobra really, which means that Steel is the best thing to pair this with. If you actually look at the deck, it's almost all Amethyst. And when I built the deck, I was like, right, it's going to be Amethyst. I've got like 50 Amethyst cards here. What do I want? And the choice was between Super Goof, Flynn, and Sisu, or Giant Cobra and Mr. Smee and Pete. And in the end, I went with Mr. Smee, Pete, and the Cobra. I think Flynn's not so hot in the current metagame because of how common Belle and Cinderella are going to be, and being able to remove Flynn quite easily. I think Smee on 2 is great. The Cobra is just the truth. It's so saucy in this deck because you have so many cards in hand thanks to the Chromacon. I actually think there's a world you play 4 Chromacons. I have this one sleeved up and ready to go. Obviously, I need to get the set 7 cards still, but as soon as I get a Honey Marin, this is my family, and the Cobra's out of the packs. They're going straight into that deck, ready for testing. But can you believe it? There is another Amethyst Steel deck, and I've also got this one sleeved up and ready for release day. Oh my goodness, JAFAR. The Reign of JAFAR is coming very soon, and I am so excited for this deck. This is a JAFAR deck built differently to what you usually see people play. JAFAR is just my kind of card. I love trying to win the game in an unorthodox way. And I think this deck has real potential. The big new thing it got is this 3-power JAFAR, which we've talked about a lot already in this video. It's very strong on its own, and it's a great shift target. That means you've now got a really strong 2-cost and 3-cost JAFAR, which is perfect for a shift. You don't really want to be playing a JAFAR on turn 4 to shift onto when you could be playing something like a Genie, for example. And speaking of Genie, that's right, we are rocking 3 Genies and 4 Elsas, as well as 3 copies of the Lamp. Banish this item. If you have a character named JAFAR in play, draw 2 cards. If you have a character named Genie in play, return chosen character with cost 4 or less to their player's hand. Unfortunately, that stipulation on 4 cost or less does mean you can't bounce back a Maui half shark, which is rather heartbreaking, but that still sounds like a really nice bit of tempo. You could go for the Lamp on turn 2, JAFAR on turn 3, Genie on turn 4, and immediately click the Lamp if you so desire, or you could wait to shift JAFAR, which then that Lamp is also going to gain you 2 lore. I think that when you play a JAFAR deck, the trap that a lot of people have fallen into in the past is that they've played Robin Hood and they've played Archimedes. And while those cards are fine, you've got the best 1-drops in the game. The Chernobogs and the Magic Broom. Now you might be saying, Spessy, is everything okay? Where's the Diablo? And I know I'm just as surprised as you are that I'm not playing Diablo, but I've made an exception because I have the Mickey Mouse Food Fight Defender. Underestimating him is a recipe for disaster. This is the most reliable shift card in Disney Lorcana. I'm surprised more people don't go for it. Now, admittedly, The Mickey Mouse that you shift onto it is not very impressive, I have to say. It's got resist 1, and if you have a broom, you deal 1 damage, basically. And you probably don't have a broom. So really, it's a 3/4 with resist, which isn't very impressive for a 5-cost card. But the important thing is that you can reliably shift it and sing a whole new world. This deck really struggles, JAFAR decks struggle, when you end up in a spot where you just can't sing a whole new world. And I think that the Mickey Mouse gives you that nice, consistent way of getting the whole new world through. But it also allows us to play the legendary card I am most excited for. It is so spicy. It's Mickey Mouse Inspirational Warrior. There's also an enchanted of this. It's a 2-cost uninkable with a 1/1 stat line, and it quests for 1. Terrible stats, but wait until you hear its ability. During your turn, whenever this character banishes another character in a challenge, you may play a character for free. So if on turn 2, I play Mickey Mouse Inspirational Warrior, I am threatening next turn to play a crab, or actually, as it turns out, JAFAR Aspiring Ruler, to remove a card on my opponent's side of the board and play a JAFAR on turn 3. What? So the reality is that when you play Mickey Mouse, what's probably going to happen is they're either going to remove it, which is good because otherwise, that bit of removal they use on Mickey Mouse could otherwise have gone on a JAFAR, for example, or on a Genie. Or the Mickey Mouse freezes their board. And I do freezes like this because basically they might not quest because they're going to fear that you are able to then boost it up and challenge. What that means then is if they do that, you might just shift your Mickey and sing a whole new world, and then you're away to the races, and then you can start playing down more cards. So it's a shift target as well, and it's really fun. I don't think you want to play too many of these, 3 max, but it's a really cool idea. And the Pete's great in these decks. The Fox is just too strong not to play. I see a lot of JAFAR players not playing Smee and Fox, but these are 2 of the most broken cards in the game, in my opinion. I actually wouldn't be surprised if at some point in the future these cards get banned. They're that strong. They really, really are overstated in almost every single way. I think they could both be uninkable and still might see some play, but that's a topic for another day. I think the Genie is an interesting inclusion as well. It's quite fast-paced, which is really what this deck's looking to do. And with the lamp, I think it's a really nice addition. What you can do is you can set these lamps up ahead of time, and then when you shift your JAFAR, you've got that explosion of lore, potentially. The Magic Broom and the Chernobogs, by the way, if you draw with them, when your JAFAR is exerted, you also gain a lore. And I think Elsa's really interesting in this deck as well, because she rushes in, so you get some good value from her. But then when Elsa's down on the board, she tends to be a little bit lackluster, doesn't do that much well. Bam! Now she can sing a whole new world. I think that sounds great. Like, I am so excited about this list I've built. It's sleeved up and ready to go. How good is JAFAR going to be? We'll have to wait and see. I think it got a lot better. I do think it got a lot better. And I'm really excited to give it a spin. It's potentially got enough explosiveness with the Pete protection as well to beat Ruby Sapphire. And again, with that Pete and with that explosiveness, it might even have a chance to beat the Amber Steel decks as well. We'll have to wait and see. When they don't have Zeus, the JAFAR is much more difficult for the aggressive Amber Steel decks and those Blue Steel decks to deal with. So I'm really excited for this one as well. All right, so moving away from the Speci Cook decks, let's go back to something more traditional and something that you will have seen before. It's Amber Steel Songs, but I think it got one card in particular which is really, really cool and really good for this deck. It got quite a few new things. It got the Troubadour, which is very similar to Ursa Vanessa. When the Troubadour was first announced, I think a lot of us were like, oh my god, it's strictly a better Vanessa. But then the guys that play Amber Steel all the time were in my YouTube comments saying, oi, Specky, don't you know, mate, the Ursula Vanessa is better because of the synergy with Rapunzel. You can charge him with a Vanessa and heal 3 with Rapunzel. If you try to do the same with Troubadour, you'd only draw 2. So I put 1 copy of the Troubadour in because you've got the option of doing that. You can mix and mash, right? You've now got the option of playing both. Maybe you could increase the count of Zeus that you play, for example, as a result of doing that. The other 3 new things that this deck has got potentially is Aurora Waking Beauty, who's a legendary and has an enchanted, Singer 5, but she is a 1/4, so she can be broad, she can be removed by Little Sisu without even a ice block, which could be relevant, by the way. Whenever you remove 1 or more damage from a character, ready this character. She can't quest or challenge for the rest of this turn. So I think the best use of Aurora is the synergy with Rapunzel. You slam in to something with Aurora like you might do with a Vanessa. You heal her with Rapunzel, she readies, and then you sing. But then, like, what are you really going to sing? You don't want to sing a whole new world after you've just played Rapunzel now, do you? So I'm not really too convinced by Aurora overall. I think she's interesting, and I did want to draw your attention to her, but you might just be better off playing a card like Gaston, which is a 3/3 Singer 5. The other card I've got in here that's a character, which I think is fascinating, is Isabella Madrigal in the moment. This card will be strong, and it will be in the meta somewhere. This is a new card, which I think has huge potential. Whenever one of your characters sings a song, this character can't be challenged until the start of your next turn. Kind of similar to the Snow White we were talking about earlier, that 4-cost Snow White, which also can't be challenged. I think that you could build some sort of deck focusing around using both of those cards and making it really difficult for your opponent to do anything. Obviously with Pete as well, Pete and Isabella and the Snow White, maybe there's a deck there somewhere. But I think she's a strong card, and obviously it makes sense when you got this many songs. But for me, the standout card that Amethyst Steel Songs got this set, and I think it's a big deal, is So Much to Give. It is an Amber song which draws a card. That is very good already. I don't think there's a single Amber song which says draw a card. There's Be Our Guest, which replaces itself, and you can tutor a character. But So Much to Give just draws you a card, and chosen character gains Bodyguard until the start of your next turn. I think that is very good. That is very, very good in my opinion. Now, one thing I've just thought of is what happens if you give Isabella Madrigal So Much to Give. You sing something and give her Bodyguard. I would imagine if a Bodyguard can't be challenged, they can just challenge the other things. I would imagine that's the ruling on that. Let me know in the comments below. Similar to if you have like an evasive Bodyguard, if your opponent can't challenge it, they just challenge other stuff. So I'm pretty sure if you try and break the game with that, it's not going to work. But for example, just imagine you give your Troubadour Bodyguard, or you give your Pete Bodyguard, and suddenly your Ariel is much more difficult to deal with, or suddenly your Daisy Duck is much more difficult to deal with. I think it's just good because it's also just giving you more songs for your Ariel to hit. And I think it's a high quality inkable song which draws and has an upside. I think it's very good. Overall, I think Amethyst Steel Songs is still a great deck. I think it's still going to be one of the best decks in the game. And it's got a few new interesting tools which you can experiment and play around with. But Specky, we don't want Amethyst Steel Songs. We want cool new decks with bad color combinations which suddenly could be good thanks to a single new dual ink card who goes by the name of MUSHU. Oh my days, Ruby Steel. Is it a real deck all of a sudden? I don't know. Maybe? So MUSHU is the new centerpiece card, and a lot of you are going to be quite surprised actually about what my list looks like. MUSHU reads, whenever one of your characters challenges, they gain resist 2 during that challenge. And during your turn, whenever one of your characters banishes another character in a challenge, gain 2 lore. So it's very easy to look at MUSHU and think, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to build my whole deck around this idea of challenging. And I think that is a massive, massive mistake. MUSHU is actually, if you look at it, just a really good card in a vacuum. If you just don't get too carried away and try and build a challenge deck that's all in on this, which by the way, might work. I'm not saying don't try it, but my philosophy is I just look at MUSHU and I say, yeah, that's strong. Whenever one of my characters challenge, they gain resist 2. So my Calhoun's going to have resist 3. My Mulan is going to have resist 2. My Super Goof is going to have resist 2. That all sounds great. And during your turn, if I banish another character in a challenge, I gain 2 lore. That also sounds great. That means that I can just play MUSHU, and the turn I play it, I take a single challenge, and I've already gained 2 lore from MUSHU before anything's happened. Like, MUSHU is just really good on its own, without the need to build a bad deck with challenging around it. Now, don't get me wrong, it's worth a try, and you might be able to do it. But what I decided to do instead was I decided to build a deck filled with good cards, with enough card draw, and with questing power. So the biggest weakness, honestly, of Ruby Steel historically has been this 1 cost mark and card draw. You could go for a whole new world as a means to card draw. You could go like for an action heavy deck as well with like the Maui Half Shark, maybe Robin Hood Sharpshooter. But there's 2 really strong card draw tools available, and those go by the name of Dock and Beast. So I've got Dock and Beast in the deck as my 2 ways of drawing cards. The 1 cost mark has historically been quite weak for Ruby Steel as well. You've got like the Robin Hood. I really hate these vanilla two cards that just don't do much. And I have to say, I don't love Happy either, but I think Ruby Steel needs to be positioned in a way where it's quite speedy. You need to be able to go under Ruby Sapphire. Remember, we're trying to build decks which can beat Ruby Sapphire, but also contend with the Steel onslaught of Belle and Cinderella. So we need to be quite speedy. And our 1 cost characters aren't great, but they have good stats, right? Like Moana, she's hardly going to challenge because she can only challenge if we have a captain in play. I think the only captain we have here is Gantu, so she can eventually challenge, but it's probably not going to happen. Happy has some synergy with the Seven Dwarfs Mine, and it can deal with evasives, also with the JAFAR, by the way, like the mini crab. You're seeing I'm a big fan of this card. I really, really like it. The Mulan, another card I'm a big fan of, can allow us to discard that extra dock if we have it, can allow us to discard a Calhoun if we don't want to play it, for example. That sort of thing. We've just got the classic Smee. Benja, I think, is a really nice tech option. I mentioned him earlier in the video. Going to be great against people playing the Sapphire Coil in particular. Maybe we might see a resurgence of Fishbone Quills and that sort of thing in Sapphire Steel. And I think it's a really good time to be playing Benja. I think Benja also could end up making it into those Amethyst Steel decks. Supergoof is great for that late game lore. You guys know I love Gantu, Captain Cranky Head, and the fact he's a captain is nice synergy with both Moana and Mr. Smee. And finally, the Mulan. It's possible you only want to play like 1 or 2 of these, but with how strong the 1 cost Mulan is and how weak the rest of the Ruby and Steel 1-drop 1 cost cards are, like suddenly you've got a big reason to play Mulan, which is that you can shift it. In the list I've actually got Sleeved, which again, I need to get my MUSHUs and my JAFARs and Mulans and add them to the deck. But the list I've got sleeved and prepped, I've actually put 3 Mulan Elite Archers in just because I really want this combo to come off. But I have a feeling 1 or 2 of the shifts might be better. Also worth noting that with the Mulan, if you play Mulan and don't shift it, the following turn you could play JAFAR and deal 4 damage to 3 different things at once. So there's some nice synergy there with JAFAR as well. Brawl and Seven Dwarfs Mine to round it out. I just think it's a really fun looking deck which might have some legs. It is a bit of a shame that none of the cards quest for 2 in the early game, but I think, like I say, it's only really Daisy Duck out of those cards that can do that anyway. I think it's solid. You might want to play just 2 copies of Happy. I personally think 11 1-drops is like my pet number. If I'm playing a deck, I think 11 1-drops is a good amount, but a lot of people prefer 10. And yeah, there's definitely some other things you could experiment with on Ruby Steel. Like I say, you could try a more challenge-heavy deck. You could try a location list with John Silver, for example. I think that might be worth exploring. But for me, this list looks pretty damn promising. I'm excited to try it out. Okay, Spessy, that's more like it, I hear you say. But we want more unorthodox ink color combinations with new dual ink cards which might be able to break the meta. Well, say no more. I give you the blue and green machine. And yes, it's no secret, I love this color combination. I played it so much last set. I won my Scar Champion map with it, but I also lost a lot. In fact, it is the worst performing deck I've really played seriously. Ever. But I love it. It's so much fun. It's difficult to play, but I have to say it got a lot better. It got some fascinating tools. There's actually 3 different ways you can play Emerald Sapphire, so make sure to subscribe to look out for the other versions of Emerald Sapphire. There's a Hero Hammer list where you're going to be shifting a bunch of stuff, and there's also potentially an Ink Gazer list as well. Maybe you even play both of those in the same deck. Who really knows? But for me, this is the best way to start. It's very similar to the decks that I was playing in set 6 and mastered, but it got a couple of new tools, and the most important of these has a unique keyword, which is Universal Shift. Baymax, the giant robot, shift 4 onto anything. That does not include items, but any character, so Clarabelle and Tipo, I am looking at you. Baymax can shift on turn number 3, because obviously you're ramping on turn 2. When you play this character, if you use shift to play him, remove all damage from him. That's almost never going to be relevant, but one thing that's worth mentioning that you could experiment with is you could experiment with playing some copies of the Belle, the new common Belle, the 3 cost that we've been talking about so much, because the Belle could maybe make a challenge in the early game, take something out, and then you could shift onto the Belle with Baymax and actually heal as well, essentially. So you can get some really good value from Belle potentially with Baymax as well, which is quite interesting. Why is this so good? Because it's costing you 4 to shift it on, so you're losing the body of Clarabelle or Tipo. Why not just play Scrooge McDuck? Well, Scrooge McDuck cannot challenge immediately, whereas Baymax can. The biggest weakness of these decks by far, well, there's a couple things. Inconsistency is one, difficult to play is another, but the biggest weakness by far is Pete and Daisy Duck. Pete and Daisy Duck give this deck a lot of problems, because if you actually look, you've got about 20 songs, you've got about 10 items, which means you've only got about 30 characters. Actually, honestly, less. Let's count. We've got 16, 18, 21, 25, 27 characters. So Daisy Duck is missing most of the time. So Daisy Duck's just going to sit there questing, gaining 2 lore. How on earth do you deal with Daisy Duck with this deck? Well, you might bounce it back with the Muses, but then guess what? They play it again the next turn alongside a Pete. Uh-oh, that's not very good. So you really need to remove that Daisy when it's exerted. That's what the Cricky is also kind of aimed at doing. I actually think there's a world you play more than 2 Crickies, because it can turn your Clarabelle into a 4-2, or your Tipo into a 4-2, or your Hiram Flavisham into a 4-6. Honestly, Cricky is an absurdly good card in this deck, which quests for 3. But Baymax is doing a similar thing. It can be played down on turn 3, and it can essentially rush. You just get to charge in with Baymax and challenge immediately, which is just brilliant for this deck, because you already want to play this Clarabelle on turn 1 to threaten the shift, and you already want to play the Tipo, but then they just kind of sit there doing nothing. If you don't have the shift, you're kind of in trouble. But now, this 1-drop Clarabelle not only represents the threat of the big Clarabelle, it also represents the threat of the Baymax giant robot. And it allows you to just get some early game board control and slow your opponent down. That's what the Cricky and the Baymax both do so well. It is hard to understate how good this Baymax is for this deck. It does everything you want a card to do in this deck. It's also worth mentioning, Baymax is great at singing songs. It can sing You're Welcome, How Far I'll Go. Anything you want it to sing, it's going to be able to do, including, by the way, Under the Sea. So I think Under the Sea becomes a really fascinating option with Baymax, because let's say you go Clarabelle on 1, Tipo on 2, Baymax shift onto Clarabelle on turn 3. Suddenly you could exert your Tipo and exert your Baymax, and you have a turn 3 Under the Sea. That's pretty good. Now, why then have I not put Under the Sea in the deck? And it's because it's that fine balancing act. You need to be good against your traditional decks, while also in the back of your mind have the big red, blue boss of the gym in the back of your mind. Because if your deck's not beating Ruby Sapphire, your deck is not very good. So how do you beat Ruby Sapphire? And that's something I'm still not completely sure of. in the list I played last set, I had Belle in there as a really explosive card alongside the Lucky Dime. And it is worth mentioning the Tamatoa here, which whenever this character quests, you may play an item for free, can let you get this dime down really quickly indeed, which is a nice, interesting bit of synergy. But there aren't really many good targets for the Lucky Dime, and the Lucky Dime really is just in there to try and tech for Ruby Sapphire a little bit. I'm not 100% sure that the Lucky Dime is necessarily the best way to go. So without Belle, the deck is a little bit slower, and I'm definitely going to be doing a lot of testing in the coming days on how best to beat Ruby Sapphire. But the Tamatoa is interesting because I used to play the 8-cost Tamatoa, mainly just for the reason of getting a single Porpsicle back is a really good card draw tool. What this deck looks to do is you look to play Bend to My Will. It is the centerpiece card where you make your opponent discard their whole hand. I've discarded 13 cards at once. It's become normal for me. In an ideal world, you play the Muses, you sing You're Welcome with the Muses, so you bounce back maybe a half Shark with the You're Welcome, bounce back a Hiram Flavisham with the Muses, and on the same turn, play Bend to My Will to discard everything. It is absolutely brutal, but it is inconsistent. It's difficult to set up. And what happens then after the Bend to My Will is a big question. How do you win after you've discarded your opponent's whole hand? Because you might not have that many cards either in your hand at that point. And that's really where the Hiram Flavisham and the Tamatoa item recursion concept comes in. One single Porpsicle off a Tamatoa that it might bring back from your discard can very quickly turn into 6 or 7 cards, because the one Porpsicle, and maybe it gives you 2, right? Maybe it gives you 2 items back from the Tamatoa. Suddenly with the Flavisham, that's 6 cards in hand after a turn or 2, and that is how you can win the late game after that Bend to My Will. So there's definitely some things to play around with here. You can see I've also got the Sapphire Coil in there as a one-of. Maybe you want to play more copies of Sapphire Coil because it can be potentially very strong in this deck when you have cards like How Far I'll Go and an abundance of ink with Clarabelle as well. Another key play to look out for with this deck, which is easily missed, is that you can play the 1-drop Clarabelle on turn 6 and immediately shift the 7-drop Clarabelle on turn 6, draw a bunch of cards, and then play the Bend the following turn, because that's what you really want to try and do. You want to try and get Clarabelle shift through and then use the Bend to My Will. That is the absolutely most devastating setup for this deck. I love this deck. I can't wait to play it some more, and I hope the Baymax is the difference maker. No serious meta report video would be complete if it doesn't include Emerald Steel. And not many new things in this one. The main thing is the Pete Space Pirate. Shift 4. While this character is exerted, opposing characters can't exert to sing songs, and your pirate characters gain resist 1. I don't really know how good Pete Space Pirate is. You've got Mr. Smee as a pirate, and I think that might be it. But I thought it was worth mentioning in the deck because it is a new tool that the deck got. Mulan also being able to discard a dock. I don't know about Emerald Steel at the moment, and the big reason is it's again that balancing act. How do you beat Ruby Sapphire, and how do you beat the Steel decks? And really, your best bet is maybe with Cursed Merfolk to go under Ruby Sapphire, and discard is very strong against both of those decks potentially, but also like they might have an easy time dealing with your Diablo. So maybe the key is go heavier on the Coves to make the Storm Rage on more difficult to remove Diablo. I'm not sure. I think there's a world that you can do well with Emerald Steel. It's a very strong deck, especially when people aren't teched for Diablo. It does arguably become better, but I think it's also a color combination which is worth experimenting with. And this list is very similar to the list which Zan Syed got top 4 at the North American Championships with last set. And I think the Pete is definitely not a bad card by any stretch of the imagination. That is all we've got time for today, but make sure to subscribe so you see the next video, which is going to be covering all of the off-meta, more budget-friendly decks potentially. Things like Amber Sapphire Puppies. I've got another fun Amber Sapphire deck brewed up which doesn't play any puppies. Ruby Emerald, all those kinds of things. Any deck that was missing from today's video that you would like to see covered in the next one, let me know in the comments below. And don't forget, if you want to support my channel, you can support me on Metafy, where you can get some really awesome perks, such as personalized deck building advice from me on a weekly basis. And as always, a huge shout out to Card Market, who sponsored this video. Thank you very much, Card Market. Buy your singles online in Europe from Card Market. Don't forget to subscribe and give the video a big fat old like if you enjoyed it, and let me know in the comments what decks do you want me to cover in the next video.